Hello and welcome to today's webinar on using the many analytical tools available to researchers at GEDmatch.com. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Vice President of Education and Programming here at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator for today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is GEDmatch power user and genetic genealogist, Dr. Tim Janzen. He is the co-founder of the Institute for Genetic Genealogy. He's a 45-year veteran of genealogical research and a 16-year veteran of genetic genealogy research in particular. Dr. Janzen's expertise in genetic genealogy is particularly strong in the areas of phasing and autosomal DNA analysis. He's been a consultant to the genetics companies 23andMe as one of their ancestry ambassadors. He's also been a consultant for Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and Ancestry.com. In addition, Tim has been involved in Mennonite genealogical research for the past 25 years. So in recent years, GEDmatch has developed increasingly powerful tools for genetic genealogists. With genetic profiles of about 1.8 million people in the database, GEDmatch's database size and the analytical tools offered really allow you to further your genealogical research and to help break through some of those genealogical brick walls. This presentation will highlight the most important features of GEDmatch that every genealogist needs to understand and to use. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to address as many questions as we can at the end. Our presenter has also very kindly shared the slides of today's presentation, and you'll find a link to this downloadable PDF in your reminder email, as well as in your follow-up email after today's broadcast. I'll also drop a link to those slides in the chat momentarily. We are also recording this event, and starting later today, you can freely go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website, as well as our YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, especially I know that there are several long URLs within the presentation, don't worry, you can always review the presentation later, pause, jot down those links, and again, you also have access to the slides. All right, so without further ado, I'll turn things over to Tim.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Ginevra. First of all, as an overview, today we're going to talk about the basics of GEDmatch, and I'm going to introduce the company. I am not a GEDmatch employee and have no basic connection with the company other than the fact I'm a very serious autosomal genetic genealogist, and I love to do research in this area. So I want to hit the highlights of the GEDmatch website and give you as much background as I can here over the next 50 minutes or so. So these are some of the features we're going to be discussing today: the one-to-one comparison, the one-to-many comparison. I'm going to introduce the multi-kit analysis, but I'm not going to go into that in any great detail. I'm also going to introduce the triangulation feature, which is a very nice tool to look at shared matches who share the same DNA sample. So the other things that I want to talk about today are the shared ancestors and shared surname features, which you can utilize, and some of the more recent features that have been added to the website as well, including the AutoCluster, AutoSegment, and AutoKinship features. Here is a karyotype of a human genome. So this happens to be a male because there are an X and a Y chromosome down at the bottom of the slide there on the right side. The rest of the chromosomes are all autosomal chromosomes. We have 22 pairs of autosomal chromosomes in our genome, and the largest being chromosome 1 on the left upper side there, and chromosome 22 being the smallest on the right lower side. So GEDmatch is a company that was founded by a computer programmer named John Olson and Curtis Rogers, who is a retired Quaker Oats executive. And they are both very passionate about genealogy and particularly about genetics. And so they founded this website after the earliest genetic genealogy companies came into being, and they realized there was a need to create an independent website where people could compare DNA with each other. And so that was the origin behind GEDmatch. As both John and Curtis got older, they decided that they were going to go ahead and sell the company, which occurred 3 years ago. And the forensic company Verigen purchased all the data and the website. So GEDmatch provides a means for people to compare their DNA with each other, and has a lot of other features too, which I'll be discussing here in just a minute. The data that's utilized typically is data from the major testing companies, which I show here. Keep in mind that GEDmatch is free if you're going to use all the basic functions, but if you're going to become a power user or want to have access to the more sophisticated features at GEDmatch, you'll need to pay $10 per month for that option. So there are currently somewhere around 1.6 million people in the GEDmatch database that are available for matching. You can also upload a GEDCOM file to GEDmatch, and there are currently about 350 million people in these GEDCOM files. GEDmatch is continuing to grow, and it's getting about 500 or so new uploads each day. There are currently 2 different versions of the GEDmatch website. One is the classic or older version, and then the newer version, which has been called GEDmatch Genesis, but keep in mind that the classic version or the older version is going to be phased out, and all the new content is going on to the new version. I want to make sure you're aware that there's quite a bit of educational material available for learning how to use GEDmatch. Andy Lee has developed quite a few different educational videos, and those are available at the URL shown here. GEDmatch is reorganizing its website and will be changing the URL during the next month or so. And also there's a very nice website that Kitty Cooper has developed that you may want to take a look at. She's done a very nice video on the GEDmatch features. I'd encourage you to look at that. There's also a WikiTree option, so you can take a look at Wiki for GEDmatch and take a look at all the information that GEDmatch has on their Wiki. There's also an educational forum available, which you can utilize. Many people are discussing GEDmatch issues and features on that forum. And also GEDmatch has developed some live chat support for Tier 1 users that's only available on weekdays during the during the hours of 9 to 4 on weekdays on Pacific time. So the first thing you want to do when you get going at GEDmatch is create an account there. Here you're going to input your name and your email address and some basic information about yourself. And then from there, you'll be able to upload a raw data file from one of the DNA testing companies. So here's a screenshot of the website for uploading your DNA to GEDmatch. Here you have to choose a raw data file from your computer hard drive. Click on that choose file option there, and then put in the donor, which you may be you initially, but it could be other relatives, and then information about that donor and the name of the testing company, etc. As you're uploading your raw data file, I would strongly encourage you to upload a GEDCOM file of your family tree as well. The reason this is important is it's very difficult to do genealogical resources without having family tree information available. I frequently say this in my presentations, that there are 2 major aspects to doing proper autosomal DNA analysis, and that's you have to have the family tree of the person you're comparing yourself to, and you need to know the matching segment data for your matches. And so GEDmatch allows you to do both, but if you only do part of this by uploading only your raw data file and not providing a tree, then your matches are going to need to contact you individually and send you an email address an email message to try to get your pedigree chart, and that gets a little bit cumbersome. So I'd encourage everyone to upload a GEDcom file. If you want to learn more about how to do this, Family History Fanatics has created a video that explains how to do that. And I would encourage you to include all of your ancestors going back at least 10 generations, and you may want to go back even to 15 generations to ensure more or less completeness. Beyond 15 generations, it's probably not necessary, although you could include that if you need to. You probably don't need to include Charlemagne if you descend from Charlemagne, so keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that the GEDmatch limit for the amount of people you can include in a GEDcom file is 10,000. Here's a screenshot of the website where you can upload your GEDcom file. So I would encourage you to do this. You put in your name, and then you have to link also the kit number to the person in the GEDcom file. So that's an important step as well. You can see my mom there having been linked to my particular GEDcom that I uploaded. Another collaboration that has occurred since 2016 is between WikiTree and GEDmatch. You may be familiar with WikiTree, which is a free online universal family tree that has been around for many years. And GEDmatch and WikiTree have been cooperating, and you can include your link to your WikiTree profile at GEDmatch. And I would strongly encourage you to do that. If you haven't created a profile at WikiTree, I would encourage you to do that as well. You can find all these matches you've linked to WikiTree on various different one-to-many features at GEDmatch. So there are basically 6 different types of analysis that you can do at GEDmatch, and I've included those here. You can look for matching segments on the autosomes. You can look for matching segments on the X chromosome. You can do autocluster analysis, look for triangulated groups, which is where people share the same DNA segment with each other. You can also look for admixture, which is sometimes referred to as ethnicity estimates or biogeographical analysis. And I will not be talking about that particular feature here very much on this particular presentation because of lack of time. You can also do GEDcom analysis, which is where we're comparing GEDcoms to each other. So the first feature I want to make sure you all understand how to use is the lookup feature. And I use this all the time. In fact, I just used it just 2 days ago when I got an email from one of my correspondents, and they said they'd uploaded to GEDmatch. And so I use this feature to take a look to find their GEDmatch kit number and also the kit number for their brother, because she'd also uploaded her brother's kit. So I wanted to have that information so I could run the appropriate comparisons. So I use this feature to get the GEDmatch kit numbers. I also sometimes use it if I want to get a GEDcom file and see if there's any information on the person's pedigree chart at GEDmatch. So here is a screenshot of the web page where you can look this up, and you can input data from any of these 3 bits of information into the 3 fields there. In most cases, I'm going to input the email address because that's usually what I have available to look for a kit number or a GEDcom ID number. And then you click display results and you get the information. I'm now going to introduce some of the other free tools that GEDmatch offers. Most of these I'm going to be talking about in this presentation to a certain extent, but I'm going to highlight a few that I'm not going to be talking about otherwise. One is the DNA diagnostic utility, where you can look for potential problems. Also, self-explanatory is the link there to, are your parents related to each other? And this will tell you, if you put in their kit numbers, how closely your parents are related. I'm also not going to talk about archaic matches, but another one you may want to be aware of is the ancestry features tool. So that's at the very bottom. You can basically look for a project that is involving a ancestral surname. So I recently added my grandmother to the McIntyre project because my grandmother's maiden name was McIntyre. I also want to talk about some of the Tier 1 utilities. These are the paid utilities, and here are a complete list of all of those. The ones that I won't be otherwise highlighting during today's presentation include phasing, which is where you look for a series of SNPs that people are receiving from one particular parent. So if you take a parent-child pair, for instance, and you phase the data, you can figure out which DNA segment came from that particular parent. If you have two parents available, then you can figure out the DNA segments that came from both parents a little bit more readily. And you can create phase kits at GEDmatch, and these allow for more accurate matching. So you're going to get fewer false matches, particularly for shorter segments if you use the phased kits. Another corollary to that is the My Evil Twin option, which John Olson created about 7 years or so ago after discussing this topic with me. So this is the segments that your parent has that they didn't pass to you. So in my case, it'll be my mom's DNA segments or my dad's DNA segments that they didn't pass down to me. Approximately half of our autosomal DNA is passed down to each child. So this can be another very interesting thing for you to look at. I'd also like to highlight the Lazarus tool, which is where you use the raw data files from various different close relatives to reconstruct a portion of the profiles for your ancestors. In most cases, you're going to be creating profiles for your parents, great-grandparents, or possibly grandparents, depending on the situation, using your close relatives, first and second cousins. And once you've created a profile using the Lazarus feature, then you can search for matching segments for people who are related to that particular ancestor. I think it's a really cool feature, and I encourage you to create a Lazarus profile or more, if depending on how many people you have in GEDmatch who will be helpful for creating such profiles. And I think that's about it for this, except for also the Q matching one-to-one is a more sophisticated one-to-one comparison. And I think I'll be talking about most of the other features during this presentation. So I want to first introduce the one-to-one comparison feature, which is where you take two GEDmatch kit numbers and compare them to each other to see if they have any matching segments, or oftentimes referred to as a half identical region. I use this feature all the time, and I encourage you to get very familiar with it. Also related to this is the one-to-many search feature, which allows you to look for all of your matches within the database. Now, GEDmatch has 4 of these different versions, and the most sophisticated is the full version on the Tier 1 option. So keep that in mind. So we'll be talking about that particular version in the next slide. So here is the input field for the full version. You can see that I've input the kit number for my grandmother, Maud Youngman, in this particular field. And then I have various different options. I can choose how many people I want to include in this, up to, I believe it's 10,000 number of total matches. So you can choose a limit there. You can choose the centimorgan size, the various different other options you can choose. So X or autosomal, for instance, and the amount of overlapping SNPs. So if I run that feature and I get the output, I've only included here the first line of my grandmother's output, which includes my mother. My mother, of course, being the daughter of my grandmother, would be the top match in her list. And we can see various different things about that. We see my mother's kit number, my email address, the fact that there's a GEDcom file for my mother there, how long this comparison has been available for, which is around 5 years or so. And then various different other things you can click on. I want to highlight the fact that these little up and down arrows, you can actually click on those and they will resort your match list by that particular field. So if you want to see who has a GEDcom file or a WikiTree address, you can click on that and it'll just pull up the people who have GEDcom files in the database. I also want to highlight the fact that you get the total number of matching centimorgans down there. So since it's a parent-child pair, you see 3577 there, and the largest segment, which is 151 in this particular segment. So keep in mind, you can click on that 151, and that'll take you to a one-to-one comparison, as we see in the next slide. So here is a comparison between my mom's kit and my grandmother's kit. You can kind of see that in those fields there. And so you can transition and start doing a one-to-one comparison. Next, we'll look at the next slide, which shows a one-to-one comparison between my kit and my grandmother's kit. And there are various different options you can use here. You can click on the graphics and positions option, which allows you to see both the numbers of matching segments as well as the graphics for that, or you can choose either the graphics or the position alone. My general preference is to only choose the position because I'm generally interested in the matching segments, but there may be times when you want to look at both of those. You can also choose the build that you want to have. And most people are typically choosing build 37, but build 38 is slightly newer and you might want to use that. So if we run this comparison between my grandmother and me, you can see the various different segments we share on the first 4 chromosomes. You see the start and stop positions, the number of shared centimorgans, and the number of SNPs in each of those segments, as well as some other background information. If we look at the graphics display, you can see that there are regions of the genome where I don't share any DNA with my grandmother. So there are 3 primary colors you need to make sure you understand here. The red color means that there are no shared DNA segments in that particular region of the genome. And GEDmatch delineates that by putting a black line under that particular segment. So it means that there's no shared DNA. Then the yellow regions mean that there is at least one shared DNA segment in that particular area, what we refer to as a half identical region or matching segment. And that's delineated underneath that by the blue. So that means that there's shared DNA in that area. The third area you need to make sure you understand is the green segments. Now, in this particular segment, my grandmother doesn't share any large full identical regions with me, but you can see some small little green lines here where there are tiny regions of the genome where my grandmother and I do share a fully identical segment. In order to see fully identical segments that are larger, you need to compare full siblings to each other. So this is just the basic graphics, and make sure you understand how to read all this. Now you can transition from the one-to-many comparison to various different visualization options. And what I've done here is show my grandmother's top 3 matches, which would include my mother and my mother's 2 brothers. And I've clicked on them to select them, and we can transition over into the multi-kit analysis from this screen. So multi-kit analysis is a very sophisticated set of tools that GEDmatch provides, and this could be an entire hour presentation by itself, just learning how to go through this. And I would suggest you explore all this if you have time to learn the various different fields. Now, each of these features is available as a clickable spot. So the chromosomes and segments up in the left corner there, that's the first one. There's also matrices, GEDcom, the Lazarus tool, which I introduced a little bit earlier, and then tag groups, which basically is where you have a group of people you put into a cluster because they're related to each other. My largest tag group is a McClary cluster of 50 different relatives I know who are in GEDmatch, who all are descended from my ancestor, William McClary. So you can create these tag groups and efficiently run comparisons using that. There's clustering tools, which I'll be talking about otherwise, and then you can edit your kit list as another option. On this screen, we see various different chromosome browsers that are available, and you can do segment searching and triangulation tools. And then I'm going to highlight Kitty Cooper's compact segment mapper, which basically is a chromosome mapping option. So we'll show that here in the next slide. So here I ran a comparison between my mother and my mother's second cousin, Malcolm Campbell. And you can see the blue segments there that Malcolm shares with my mother. And you can also see 4 other matches who share DNA with either Malcolm and my mother, or with each other. In this particular segment, you can see that Pete is only sharing 2 segments with my mom, and one of those overlaps with Malcolm, the one up on chromosome 1. And you can also see that Patricia, James, and Chester are sharing a segment on chromosome 8 with Malcolm and my mother. So they're part of a triangulated group. The next thing that I want to introduce is the feature to look for shared most recent common ancestors. And here you put in a kit number and you look to see if there is a shared ancestor among people who have uploaded a GEDcom file. Here's the output for that. For my mother's close relatives, my mother's father was Paul Armstrong Youngman, and we see that there are various different relatives who descend from Paul Armstrong Youngman. And these people are all included in my GEDcom ID. So you notice on the right side that they all have the same GEDcom ID because they're all close relatives of my family. I'm related out either as first or second cousins and not more distantly than that. The next thing I want to show is a more distant set of matches. These are all people who are not close relatives, but they do share somewhere between 37 centimorgans at the top with my mother, or down to 23 centimorgans there at the bottom. And I'll just want to point out that there are some distant matches here. The French connection is 13 generations away. The Sarah Riddale is 12 generations away. A point I want to make here is just because you share a DNA segment with somebody and you find a genealogical connection does not necessarily mean that the genealogical connection had to have come through that particular DNA segment. So the segment may have been passed down through a different ancestral line. So you need to do chromosome mapping to verify that the segment in question came down from the ancestor that you are aware that you share in common, because many times our pedigree charts are incomplete and sometimes we have hidden connections that we aren't aware of, but at least GEDmatch is giving us some basic information about at least one genealogical connection that we have with various different matches. So make sure you use this feature, but be careful to use it appropriately. I want to highlight one of the comparisons from the previous slide, which is with Rachel Johnson. Rachel Johnson is one of my mom's ancestors, and she was born in 1774. Here we're comparing the GEDmatch information that I uploaded on the left with somebody else's information on the right. And you'll notice that there are some discrepancies here. For instance, the birth date is different. And I believe I have the correct birth date because the July 10th date is actually the marriage date for Rachel Johnson. And I think it somehow got input into this other GEDcom file incorrectly. But anyway, I just want to make sure you are aware you can look at the genealogical data and compare this information. In some cases, they may have information that you don't. The next thing I want to highlight is the surname search tool. So here's where you basically put in information about a surname and you get the matching people who share that particular surname. So in this particular case, I went ahead and I looked for Youngman, which we'll see on the next slide. So there's various different people who have the Youngman surname, and their information is included in these GEDcom files. You can also look for matching segments. I really like this feature because this allows you to download all the matching segment data for 10,000 of your closest matches. That's a lot of people to correspond with, and you'll probably not be able to get through all 10,000 of those people in terms of collaborating or communicating with them, but I want you to know that you can get this information, and this is through the segment search option, which is available only on Tier 1. I'd encourage you to download it as a CSV file, then you can save it and integrate it into the matching segment data from other companies such as Family Finder, 23andMe, and MyHeritage that do provide matching segment data. Here's what the matching segment data looks like. You get the start and stop positions, the number of shared centimorgans and SNPs, as well as the match name and their email address so you can correspond with them, but I've left them off the slide. Triangulation is where you're looking for shared segments among various different people. I introduced this concept with Malcolm Campbell and my mother here several slides back. Here, you're going to look for the shared segments, and you can do this one chromosome at a time or in aggregate. I would generally suggest you do one chromosome at a time. You can also put in a number of different kit numbers and look for triangulated groups among those kit numbers as option 2. I generally use option 1 because I'm generally looking at only one person at a time, and I generally run this only one chromosome at a time. Here we see the output from that particular feature. These people are all sharing the same segment, and it gives you the number of shared centimorgans, so ranging between 7 and 20. And then the green bar on the right indicates that these people are all triangulated and they're all sharing the same segment. Another very nice feature is people who share one of 2 kits. So you can do a comparison. So for instance, between my mom's second cousin, Malcolm, and my mom, I can run this feature and I can look at the people who share DNA with both kits or at least one of those 2 kits. Here's the output for including my mom and some of her kit numbers, as well as my brother, Dan. If we look at this in greater detail, I've left some names off of this, but suffice it to say that my mom and Malcolm are sharing DNA with a number of different matches. I've included 7 of them on this screen. They range between 29 and 43 centimorgans for my mother and between 15 and 25 centimorgans for Malcolm. So these people are probably related to the shared Armstrong connection between Malcolm and my mom, although there could be other genealogical connections too. So be careful when you use this. You can't always assume that the shared connection in terms of the inherited DNA sample necessarily came through the known genealogical connection, which in this case is a second cousin relationship. Another very nice feature that GEDmatch has added is this ability to combine multiple kits into one. And one thing you need to keep in mind is that some of the newer SNP chips that are being used, the global screening array in particular, has relatively little overlap with the earliest SNP chips were used, which were the OmniExpress chip in general. I would suggest that you use a 23andMe version 3 kit if you have that, because that has the largest number of SNPs in it at over 900,000, and use at least one GSA chip. So that would include a recent 23andMe kit or a MyHeritage kit or a Family Finder kit from Family Tree DNA, and combine those. You can combine multiple kits up to a total of 4 in this. If you haven't done any DNA testing up to this point, you might want to consider testing at Ancestry, as well as with one of the other companies that is doing the GSA chip, and then combining those, because there's quite a bit of overlap between the Ancestry kit and the Omni Express chip. So you'll get a more complete, well-rounded set of SNPs that way, and you'll get higher quality matches if you do this. And then you can run these kits. I want to introduce the auto cluster features, which have been developed over the last 3 years or so in conjunction with E.J. Bloom in the Netherlands. You have to be a Tier 1 member, however, and you can include up to 50 matches in this. Andy Lee's done a nice video on this, so you might want to read up on that as you're learning about this particular feature. Here's the input spot. So you input the kit number, choose the number of kits you want to include in the thresholds, and then run the analysis. So here's the results for my grandmother, and it included 364 kits and generated 127 clusters with this particular analysis. You can sort the clustering results by various different options, which I've included here. The ones that I generally use are cluster size and the average number of shared centimorgans. Those are the primary options that I use when I'm using the various different options, but I just want you to know that you can sort them by other different things, and I've included the rest of those options on this slide. So here's my grandmother's auto cluster organized by cluster size. The first one in the left upper corner there happens to be a McClary cluster. So my grandmother's grandmother was Mary McClary, born 1850. And there are a lot of McClary relatives who happen to be in the GEDmatch database. And so that happens to be her largest cluster. And then the cluster size goes down, et cetera. Now here what we see is the number of clusters organized by the amount of shared centimorgans. And you can see the number of shared centimorgans up on the left side there. The first one is only got one kit in it, 42 centimorgans shared in that particular cluster. And then it continues down. You can see the numbers of shared centimorgans on the left side there. I want to also highlight that these various different fields are clickable, and I'll talk about that in a bit. You can click on the eye to get information about the person. You can click on the box there to the left to submit to multi-kit analysis. If you go over like into the red, one of those red clusters there, you can click on a box there, and that'll take you to one-to-one analysis for those particular people who are included in the analysis. This was well thought out by E.J. Bloom, and I'm very appreciative for him having developed these set of tools and collaborating with GEDmatch on this, because it's helped a lot of genetic genealogists to have these tools. Here's a auto cluster I ran for my grandmother, where I actually labeled each of the top 5 or so, showing that various different clusters are related on various different ancestral lines. My mom's mother, Maud Youngman, has McIntyre ancestry, as well as I mentioned McClary and Lawrence and Crozier. So these clusters I've labeled for your information. Now, I want you to realize that it's not always so nice, clean, simple, and easy. My dad's ancestry is predominantly Low German Mennonite. He has a tiny bit of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry as well. But if you run his auto cluster, you'll see that it turns into this big orange blob. So almost everybody who's related to my dad in GEDmatch is related through his Mennonite ancestral lines, because his Ashkenazi ancestry is a very small portion, only about 128th or so of his DNA being Ashkenazi. And so there's some small clusters you can see in the left upper side there that may be related to the Ashkenazi side or somehow else. But suffice it to say is if you have endogamous ancestry, such as Mennonite, an island population such as Hawaiian or Ashkenazi Jewish, you may get a similar result, and the auto cluster feature may not be as helpful for you. This is the bottom portion of the same slide, so you can see the same basic information for this cluster. So I've kind of tried to highlight some of these features already. The fact that the I in the brown circles is clickable, takes you to the user information in a box, and you can also do the one-to-one comparisons, as I mentioned earlier. You can also click on a particular cluster from the statistics section, which is in the right side of the auto cluster, and submit that particular cluster to do multi-kit analysis. And you could click on multiple boxes in any group of people to submit them to multi-kit analysis from the left side. I also want to highlight the gray boxes. So the gray boxes simply mean that two people are in different clusters, but they're sharing DNA with somebody else in another cluster. So don't ignore the gray boxes. That can be helpful. There's also an option to include the segment detail when you do the auto cluster display, and this will display triangulated groups, and that can be very helpful as well. And there's also an option to look to the get information about a shared ancestors and shared locations, and that's another option to create an AutoTree, and I'll discuss the AutoTree a bit in the next section. Here's the output for my grandmother showing various different triangulated groups. Here's the AutoTree for my grandmother showing the output. If I create that, you can click on those little arrows and get the shared locations, shows the various different clusters, and then surnames are down on the right side. If I run the AutoTree, basically, you can see in this particular situation that there are 3 people who share approximately 20 centimorgans with my grandmother, who descend from John Templeton and his wife, Erlene Maxey. So I'm getting some information about shared ancestry. So somehow my grandmother is related to either John Templeton or Erlene Maxey in some way. GEDmatch also will develop a GEDCOM file for you showing this connection. And here it shows the GEDCOM file back to John and Erlene. They also have the AutoSegment triangulation cluster tool, which was developed a year ago. Again, EJ Bloom worked with GEDmatch on this. And you can analyze data from as many as 3,000 of your matches in this particular triangulation tool. And Roberta Estes has done a nice blog summary on this particular tool, which I'd encourage you to read. So here's the output if I run this for my mother. We included a total of 500 centimorgans as the top match and a lower threshold of 10 centimorgans. And it's taken from the closest 10,000 matches, and then I download the results as a zip file. So here's the auto cluster feature for this with a 500 match threshold, and you can see the various different clusters there going from the left upper side down to the right lower side. And this summary, the index is on the right side there, and you can click on any of those boxes to take you over to a multi-kit analysis for that particular group. And that summarizes all of those different auto clusters. So there's a total of 46 there, and it includes the total number of people that are in each cluster. This is an informational slide that you get when you run the output. It tells you the total number of matches that are included in the output, and also gives information about the number of segments. So there basically are 268,000 segment combinations that didn't overlap, but there are overlapping a total of 2,200. So this is just an informational slide that GEDmatch provides for you when you run this particular option. Here I'm going to highlight some of these gray boxes. So in this particular situation, if I run the auto cluster from my mother, you will see that the light blue or aquamarine cluster seems to be related to the violet cluster in the middle, because there are gray boxes on the top kind of interconnecting, and also on the left side interconnecting those two clusters with each other. We will also see that you can see the same basic information for the middle violet cluster and the black cluster down to the lower right there, because there are people who share DNA between those two clusters. So this can be helpful when you're running your analysis. I would strongly encourage you to try to figure out which ancestral line each cluster is related to you on, as I showed you on a previous slide where I labeled 5 different clusters. Here's the output for the AutoSegment. So this is output for just chromosome 22. And I've opened up the zip file and taken a look at it. And you can look at the various different results. These are HTML files. If you see that little Chrome logo there, you can click on that and that'll give you an HTML file that includes your auto cluster analysis. And each of those files have additional information in them. You'll have to open those up and review them. So here, there happen to be 2 clusters for chromosome 22 for my mom, and it shows some basic information about those here. I've removed the names. Here's the information for the first cluster, and shows the start and stop positions for the people that are in that cluster, includes their match name and email address, which I've left out for the presentation. Here's the second cluster. And we basically can see that there's, again, start and stop position information and information about the SNP count, etc. So I would encourage you, when you run this, to be careful about how much data you try to get all at once, because it can take a while. And I would encourage you to at least start off with 500 kits and run the analysis, and then increase depending on how you are able to get this all to work for you. But I'd encourage you to analyze your clusters one at a time, research them, get the pedigree charts for everybody in a cluster if at all possible, and then try to figure out the genealogical connections. AutoKinship is another feature that was just released earlier this year. And this particular tool combines the cluster information with the GEDcom files to try to look for shared genealogical connections and put this information into a tree. And read up again on Roberta Esses's blog on this particular feature that she did earlier this year. You might want to just run this only for 100 kits initially, because it can take a fair bit of server time for GEDmatch to run this, and GEDmatch will kick you out after 10 minutes if the results haven't been generated by that time. So start low and then move up depending on what GEDmatch is able to do for you. So if I included 100 kits, basically I generated 15 auto clusters, and I got AutoKinship results for 6 of those clusters. Here's what the output looks like in the various different segments of this particular file. So this is how it looks on my hard drive when I get the data back. And here's what the output looks like if I look at the various different clusters. You can click on the AutoTree, you can click on the ancestors, you can click on the locations and get additional information and review that. Here's an auto cluster tree showing a connection between my mom's second cousin once removed, Frederick Mock, and my mom. We share ancestry back through the Youngman Marks line. Here's another one that also is included in another cluster. In this particular situation, I don't believe there's a close connection here on these different lines, but I'm just showing you how this all works. You can see that these 2 people here descend from T. Longara and W. Martin, and they're somehow related to my mother, probably through the Martin line and not through the Longara line. Here's the output of what this looks like for Frederick Mock through the Youngman-Marks line, and you can see the segment data, this number of shared centimorgans, and the information about the two different lines and showing that they're connected to each other. Here's a shared locations output for cluster 4, and basically you can see that there's a connection through South Carolina. These people happen to be a mother-daughter combination, so it's not particularly surprising that they have trees that connect back. But in any case, they somehow are connected through South Carolina. Here's the output for a McIntyre group, and this is the AutoTree. If there is tree information, GEDmatch puts that together very nicely for you. If there's no tree available, then they do their best job trying to fit these people into the tree, but it's not always easy to do. For instance, at the bottom, I want to just highlight that there was no tree information for the two people on the right lower side there, and those people were not descendants from Parson, Evans, McIntyre. They're actually related one generation back further, but GEDmatch wasn't able to figure out that information without the trees. And this is a McClary one that's similar. So I would suggest you run these and try to see what you can learn. I think it's a very interesting application. I'll just also mention that those little bars that are hanging down under the matches are the chromosomes where the matching segments are located. Here's an AutoKinship for another person. I don't think that there is a connection between my mother and Victoria Priscilla, but GEDmatch is generating this. It's a cluster on chromosome 11 for people who are related on my mom's family line. Here's another portion of the auto cluster feature. So it shows that there's a shared segment for cluster 4 on chromosome 16. So keep in mind that if you don't have good GEDCOM files for everybody, that's going to complicate things. And also another aspect of this is if people are sharing some fairly large DNA segments, then the AutoKinship feature may try to include a closer genealogical relationship than it really is. So these are some issues you just have to be cautious when you're interpreting the data. So in other words, it's a great feature. I think it's really helpful to have, and it's particularly helpful for people who are adoptees or have a close unknown relative, such as a parent or grandparent. And if you've done some chromosome mapping, that'll help you more properly interpret all of this information. Make sure you're contacting your matches to get their pedigree charts if they haven't uploaded a GEDCOM file. YDNA is another organization you might want to link to, and you can link directly to and put your kit number, profile number at GEDmatch. There's a relationship calculator as well that was developed by Britt Nicholson, and you might want to read up about that. He's got a blog post about it, so it can be helpful in trying to predict relationships. As we can see on the next slide here, I input 1,000 centimorgans, and basically what you can see is that the prediction that this calculator makes is that there's a 30% probability that there's a great-grandchild, great-grandparent relationship, or 27% probability of a first cousin relationship, 24% probability of a niece, nephew, etc. So these are just predictions. If you know the birth dates of the people involved, that can help you kind of sort this out. But it's a very nice relationship predictor tool that you should use if you have unknown ancestry, such as an adoptee. So in conclusion today, I've tried to hit the most powerful and most interesting features of GEDmatch. I want you to use these on a regular basis if at all possible. There's a lot to learn here, and I've just covered the highlights. Make sure you upload a raw data file there. and also make sure you upload a GEDcom file containing your ancestors. So those are the primary conclusions for today, and I think we'll go ahead and move over to the Q&A session now.
All right. Well, thanks, Tim. So before we get to your questions, I know there are a lot to get through. I did want to just share with you a few special offers and upcoming educational opportunities. So we recently announced a special benefit for members of American Ancestors. So current members can save 10% on Tier 1 membership, and you just use code AAGM 2023 at the time of enrollment. And if you'd like to learn more or kind of to further your understanding about DNA testing and how it can really be used in your family history research, there are 2 upcoming programs that you should be aware of. If you live in the New England area, it's not too late to register and attend this Saturday's workshop using DNA in family history research, which is held at the New Hampshire Historical Society and led by American Ancestors genealogist Melanie McComb. And then in January, we'll be leading a 4-week online course on practical strategies for leveraging DNA testing in genealogy. You can learn about those and all of our upcoming events at americanancestors.org/events. All right, so let's get to some questions. First of all, Tamsin asks, what is the difference between new and classic GEDmatch?
So they're simply 2 different versions of the same website. It's just that the newer features are going on to the new website, and the old version or the classic version is a outdated and older version of the website, which I still use periodically, but I'm definitely moving over to the new version. And I would suggest everybody get comfortable with the new version because the old version will be disappearing sometime this next year.
We also have several questions about GEDcom files and uploading them. So first, Tina asks, if you upload your family tree to GEDmatch, does it automatically become public if it's an otherwise private tree?
Yes, it does become public. The GEDmatch no longer allows private trees. So if you've done a lot of research on a particular family line and you don't want all that information to be public, then you shouldn't upload it to GEDmatch. My personal feeling is we should concentrate on privatizing information about living people. And if people are dead, let's get that information out there because it should be public information for deceased individuals. That's the general approach that I take.
And you mentioned that there's a 10,000 person limit for the GEDcom files. So if you do have more than that, Jim says that he has 25,000 people in his. Can you create kind of an abbreviated version of the tree?
Yes, absolutely. So what you might want to do there, depending on your circumstances, you could create basically a bare bones ancestral tree for each of the people that you upload. So if you have, say, a paternal line and a maternal line that go off in separate directions, you could, and you have both of your parents tested, then create a tree that's just including the ancestors back, say, 15 generations or so for your mother and also one for your father, and then upload those separately.
More questions about GEDcom files. Charles asks, so once you upload the GEDcom file, can you edit it, or do you have to kind of edit it elsewhere and then re-upload a new file?
Yeah, it would be nice if GEDmatch had more editing options like you can do kind of over at Ancestry, but no, at this point, you have to basically just upload a GEDcom file. It stays static once it's there. So if you have an old version, you can take your old GEDcom file down and re-upload a new one, which is kind of a hassle. That's something I'll probably be discussing with GEDmatch more about creating options to link in more people. But if you have a wiki tree, then you can just link there and then you can make your changes at WikiTree if you need to. And then you don't have to really update anything at GEDmatch. That's another option for you.
And I think final question about GEDcom files. Pat asks, if you don't upload a GEDcom file at the time that you create an account, can you do it later?
Absolutely.
Great. All right. So there were a few questions about Lazarus. I know we didn't have too much of a chance to go into that in great depth. But William says, I have no siblings. My mother died in 1964. She had one sibling, a sister, who had one child, a daughter. But, can I use Lazarus to kind of reconstruct my mother's DNA?
That gets a little bit more complicated. You have to have a certain number of people that are closely related before you can really do that. But the first cousin should definitely be tested. I've tried to test all the first cousins for my parents, if at all possible. And so you have to work with what you've got. If you don't have as much genetic data as you would like, then make the best of it. But you may be limited in terms of creating a Lazarus tool with only 2 people. But you can also just search for the matches of those 2 people and try to segregate those matches for the ancestor that you're particularly interested in focusing on too. So you don't necessarily have to have Lazarus. It's just if you have the genetic data, Lazarus is a wonderful tool to have as an option for you.
So kind of related, Mary asks, so if I have my DNA tested and my father's DNA tested, is there a possibility to calculate what my mom's likely DNA profile was?
So this goes into what I was referring to about my evil twin. So what I would do in that particular situation is to upload both of the profile, so this lady and her father, and then use the my evil twin to see the matching segments for her mother. So the DNA segments that this lady does not share with her father will be DNA segments that came from her mother, and therefore the my evil twin profile there will be essentially half of her mother's genome. And so that'll be very helpful for research purposes.
Great. A few questions about endogamy, and you mentioned this, in your own family tree or in your own DNA results. Leslie asks, which tools are best to use if a person has endogamy from the same group on both sides of her family?
This is very challenging. I recently gave a presentation in Abbotsford for our Mennonite group on this topic of endogamy and how you do that among Mennonites. I'm working very carefully on doing chromosome mapping for my father's genome, and it's quite challenging. And I sometimes make mistakes because sometimes my first, second cousins are related to my dad on multiple ways. And I have to sort that out through comparisons with dozens of other relatively close relatives. So it's challenging, but it gets into the topic of chromosome mapping. I encourage you to try to work on doing chromosome mapping, even if you have endogamous backgrounds, but it's going to take more work than it would if you do not come from an endogamous background.
Let's see. There are lots of questions, and again, I'm happy to say that that this presentation has been recorded. It will be available on YouTube and our website. And Tim has also shared the slides for this presentation, so you'll be able to access that. You'll see a link to it in your follow-up email, and we'll also post it on our website and YouTube channel as well once we post the video. Maybe just a few more questions. Let's see, Roland asks, how does it complicate things when ancestors are close cousins, such as first and second cousins? I have several in my tree.
Oh, it absolutely complicates things. That's just like the endogamous situation that my father faces. It makes it hard for you to do chromosome mapping because you're not really sure which ancestor a segment came down from. So you just have to be cautious when you're looking at the matching segment results and trying to determine where any particular DNA segment came from.
Okay, and a few questions about the X chromosome. So do all testing companies, when you upload the raw data, will there be data for the X chromosome?
Yes, I believe so. That's my recollection anyway, is that all the major testing companies are including X chromosome data in the output, but they don't all have features for that. So keep that in mind. You may not be able to do comparisons on the company website, even though the company has the data available and it's in the raw data files. That's one of the nice things about GEDmatch is you can do those types of comparisons if the raw data file does indeed include the X chromosome data.
So Sheila asks, my brother has an X match with someone who is not an X match for me. Why would that be?
Well, that simply has to do with the shared DNA. There sometimes can be DNA that is passed down on the X that the other person doesn't get. So two brothers, in theory, should have the same chromosome, but when you're talking about females, there's a possibility that the females aren't necessarily going to get the same DNA segments. You also have to kind of look at the length of the segments and things like that. There's always a possibility of a false match. And so you have to look at various different angles. So without knowing more details on that situation, I don't know that I can give additional input.
All right. Well, we've covered a lot today. Thank you again, Tim, so much for your time, for putting this together, for answering all these questions. I know there were several questions that we didn't get to. Again, actually, when you go to see Tim's slides, I will say this, Tim has very kindly put his email there. So you can email Tim if you do have additional questions. Again, look at the slides, look at the recording, and certainly, there's a lot of information, a lot of rich information in this presentation. So take a moment, you can pause, rewind, take some notes, and really start to explore some of these features on gedmatch.com. Also, it's good to know that you can always hire our team of researchers by going to research@nehgs.org. We'll do research on your behalf. And then we also have a free chat service. Tim mentioned that GEDmatch has a new free chat service. American Ancestors also has a chat service where you can talk to genealogists about really basic reference questions, almost anything in your family tree. And that's available Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 5 Eastern time, with extended hours on Wednesdays, 9 to 8 p.m. Also, I do want to mention in my follow-up email, because there were a few questions, again, you'll have a link to the slides, and you'll also have more information about that discount that I mentioned for American Ancestors members. Again, American Ancestors members get a discount of 10% off the Tier 1 membership, and so we'll include that code for you in the follow-up email. But thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit us at americanancestors.org. Best of luck in your research, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.